A crisis the president couldn't contain. At first, it looked manageable. Another challenge, another moment that would pass with the right words and careful control. But this crisis refused to stay inside the lines drawn for it. It began quietly, without panic or headlines. A situation developing faster than expected, spreading pressure across institutions that were never designed to absorb it all at once. The presidency responded as it always had, with statements, coordination, and confidence that authority would hold. It didn't. To understand why this crisis couldn't be contained, we have to understand how containment normally works. The presidency relies on predictability, clear chains of response, assumptions that once direction is given, systems fall into place. This time, they didn't. Each attempt to manage the situation revealed another layer beneath it. Every solution created a new problem. Every reassurance exposed another vulnerability. The crisis was not a single entity that could be confronted and defeated. It was a network of interconnected pressures, each one feeding the others, and addressing any single thread only shifted the strain to another. What should have been a controlled response became a series of reactive moves. Inside the White House, the tone shifted quickly. Advisors realized they were no longer steering events. They were chasing them. Information arrived incomplete. Timelines collapsed. Decisions were overtaken by consequences before they could settle. What made this crisis uniquely dangerous wasn't its scale. It was its refusal to be isolated. The presidency tried to narrow it, frame it, assign responsibility. But the crisis moved laterally across agencies, jurisdictions, expectations. No single lever could slow it down. No single authority could contain it. The architecture of government, which was designed to manage problems that flow vertically through defined channels, was confronted with a crisis that refused to respect those channels. And with every failed attempt to regain control, the perception of power weakened further. Because containment only works when everyone believes it's possible. This crisis taught the presidency a brutal lesson. Some moments don't escalate because leadership fails. They escalate because the system itself can no longer hold what's coming. And once that becomes clear, control stops being an option. It becomes a hope. As the crisis expanded, the presidency leaned harder on coordination. Agencies were aligned. Task forces multiplied. Briefings grew longer and more frequent. On paper, everything looked active, engaged, under control. But activity is not containment. Each institution interpreted the crisis through its own limits. Jurisdictional boundaries blurred. Responsibility overlapped. Decisions slowed as every move required consensus that no longer existed. The more the presidency tried to centralize response, the more resistance emerged, not in defiance, but in delay. This is how systems fail without breaking. The president issued guidance meant to unify action. Instead, it exposed fragmentation. Some complied immediately. Others adapted cautiously. A few waited for clarity that never came. The result wasn't chaos. It was inconsistency. And inconsistency is impossible to manage at scale. Inside the White House, confidence gave way to realism. The crisis was no longer something to be solved. It was something to be endured. The goal quietly shifted from containment to mitigation, from control to damage limitation. That transition, though never announced, represented one of the most significant admissions a presidency can make. That the situation had exceeded the capacity of centralized authority to manage it. That shift mattered, because once leadership abandons containment, even privately, the system senses it. Signals change, language softens, expectations drop, and external pressure increases, feeding off uncertainty. The presidency was still leading, but it was no longer setting the pace. The crisis had become self-sustaining, driven by momentum rather than command. And every attempt to rein it in now carried the risk of making things worse. This is the moment leaders fear most, when authority still exists but influence no longer matches it. And from here, every decision would be judged not by whether it solved the problem, but by whether it slowed the damage. As the limits of containment became undeniable, the presidency faced an uncomfortable truth. The crisis could no longer be managed from the center. It had outgrown the structures meant to control it. This realization forced a change in strategy. Authority was redistributed, responsibility pushed outward. Local actors were given latitude not because it was ideal, but because central control had become impossible. To the public, this shift looked like inconsistency, mixed messages, changing guidance, leaders adjusting positions in real time. Confidence eroded further as clarity disappeared. But inside the White House, the calculus was brutal and simple. Maintaining the illusion of control risked total failure. Letting go, even partially, offered a chance to survive. This is how power retreats without surrendering. The presidency remained visible, vocal, and present, but its role had changed. It was no longer commanding outcomes. It was coordinating survival, encouraging adaptation, managing perception as much as policy. Opponents seized a moment. Allies grew anxious. Institutions braced for unpredictability. Every weakness was amplified, every misstep magnified. Yet the most damaging effect wasn't political. It was psychological. Once the system accepts that a crisis cannot be contained, behavior changes everywhere. People stop waiting for instruction. They improvise. They hedge. They prioritize local survival over national coherence. The presidency had not failed, but had lost the ability to unify response. And that loss, more than any single decision, ensured the crisis would run its course on its own terms. When the crisis finally began to subside, it didn't end cleanly. There was no moment of victory, no declaration of success. It simply lost momentum, leaving behind exhaustion, damage, and a nation changed by uncertainty. The presidency survived the crisis, but it did not control it. And that distinction matters. History would later debate what went wrong. Some blamed leadership. Others blamed institutions. Still others blamed timing. But the deeper lesson was harder to confront. The crisis couldn't be contained because containment itself had limits the system never acknowledged. Authority works best when pressure is linear, predictable, and slow. This moment was none of those things. What the presidency learned was sobering. Power can guide. It can influence, but it cannot always command outcomes when complexity outruns structure. That realization left a mark on the office. Future leaders became more cautious about promises of control. Language shifted from certainty to probability, from solutions to management, from command to coordination. This wasn't weakness. It was adaptation born from humility. The recognition that the presidency, for all its power, operates within a system that has limits, and that those limits are most visible when the pressure exceeds what the system was designed to absorb. The crisis the president couldn't contain reshaped expectations of leadership itself. It reminded the nation that some moments exceed even the strongest institutions, and that survival sometimes depends less on control than on endurance. The presidency did not fail that test, but it did not pass it unchanged. And the lesson remains, one that extends beyond this particular presidency and this particular crisis, into the fundamental nature of how centralized authority interacts with distributed complexity. Some crises don't ask to be conquered. They demand to be endured. Subscribe to join the journey. A